There are mornings that look exactly like every other morning. The light comes in the same way. The city outside the window makes the same noise it always makes. And then, only later, sometimes much later, sometimes never, do you understand that something about that morning was different? That what looked like an ordinary Tuesday was actually the last page of a chapter that had been building for decades? That the person who walked out the door that morning did not know they were walking toward the last hours of their life? And that everything they said, everything they chose to share on that particular day would become the most carefully read document they ever left behind. December 8th, 1980 was that kind of morning for John Lennon. He woke up at the Dakota building on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, in the apartment he shared with Yoko Ono and their 5-year-old son Sean, and he had absolutely no reason to believe it would be anything other than a good day, a productive day, a day moving forward into a future he was genuinely excited about for the first time in years. He was 40 years old. He had just released Double Fantasy, his first album in 5 years, and the response had been everything he had hoped for and more. He was talking to journalists again, giving interviews, re-engaging with a world he had spent half a decade deliberately keeping at arm's length. He was, by every account of those who saw him that day, in a mood that the people around him described with a word that had not always been easy to apply to John Lennon. He was happy. But what John Lennon said in his final interview, the words he chose, the things he chose to reveal, the questions he answered with a candor that seemed almost reckless in retrospect, would become something far more than a promotional conversation about a new record. They would become a portrait of a man at the exact moment he had finally, after years of searching and struggling and losing his way and finding it again, arrived somewhere that felt like peace. And the tragedy of that portrait is not only what it contains, it is what it was pointing toward. What it suggested was still to come, what it promised that the world would never receive. Because the version of John Lennon who sat down for that interview on the morning of December 8th, 1980, was not the version most people thought they knew, and understanding who that man actually was, in those final hours, changes everything about what his loss meant. To understand the John Lennon of December 8th, 1980, you have to understand where he had been, not the Beatles years, which the world had catalogued exhaustively, not the Imagine era, which had given him his most enduring solo legacy. You have to understand the years in between, the years that the public narrative of John Lennon tends to skip over because they do not fit neatly into the story of a rock icon, but which were, by any honest account, the most transformative years of his adult life. After the dissolution of the Beatles in 1970 and the raw confessional fury of the Plastic Ono Band, after the global anthem of Imagine and the political activism that made him a target of the Nixon administration's immigration machinery, John Lennon had simply stopped. In 1975, following the birth of his son Sean on October 9th, his own birthday, a coincidence he found meaningful, John had walked away from the music industry with a deliberateness that shocked everyone who knew him. No farewell tour, no grand announcement. He simply closed the door on the performing, recording, touring version of himself and became, with an intentionality that was almost architectural, a father and a house husband in a Dakota apartment in New York City. The world did not know what to make of this. The music press invented narratives burned out, controlled by Yoko and creative decline. The reality was considerably more straightforward and considerably more radical. He had spent his entire adult life consumed by the machine of his own fame, had given every waking hour to the production of John Lennon, the cultural product, and had arrived at 34 genuinely uncertain whether the actual person behind that product was still alive. Sean's birth had given him a reason to find out, so he did. He learned to bake bread. He took Sean to the park. He slept without an agenda. He discovered, with the surprise of someone encountering a language they did not know they already spoke, that ordinary things were extraordinary when you were actually present for them. But something else was also happening during those 5 years. John Lennon was, for the first time in his adult life, genuinely trying to understand who he was when no one was watching. The performances had stopped, not just the concerts, but the performance of identity that fame requires constantly. And by 1980, the looking had produced something that surprised him. A man who was cautiously and with full awareness of how fragile the feeling was, beginning to be at peace. And that is the man who sat down with DJ Dave Sholin on the morning of December 8th, 1980 for what would become the last recorded interview of his life. Dave Sholin was a San Francisco-based radio DJ who had been granted one of the most coveted interview slots of that year, a sit-down with John Lennon and Yoko Ono at the Dakota to discuss Double Fantasy. Sholin arrived that morning with his team, a small crew trying, as journalists always try, to keep their professionalism intact while processing the fact that they were sitting in John Lennon's living room. What struck Sholin almost immediately was the quality of John's presence. Not star power or performance, but presence in the literal sense. John Lennon was entirely, attentively, genuinely there. He made eye contact. He asked questions about Sholin's life, his work, what he had been listening to recently. He was not managing the interview from behind a public persona. He was simply talking to another person with the ease of someone who had arrived at something more durable underneath. The apartment itself reflected this comfortable rather than ostentatious, a lived in space bearing the evidence of a small child and two working artists. There were drawings on surfaces, books everywhere. Yoko moved through the space with the natural authority of someone fully at home, and the relationship between John and Yoko, which the press had spent 15 years misrepresenting, was, in that morning room, simply a partnership. Two people who had chosen each other repeatedly through difficulty and distance, and were still choosing each other. The interview began and John talked. Not in the guarded, media trained way of someone protecting a brand, but in the open, exploratory way of someone who has decided that honesty is less exhausting than the alternative. He talked about the 5 years of silence without defensiveness. He talked about Sean without sentimentality. He talked about the new album with the enthusiasm of someone who had made something they actually believed in. But it was what he said about the future that would, in retrospect, carry the heaviest weight. John Lennon talked about the future with an openness and excitement that was unmistakably genuine. He had plans, he had songs already forming that he wanted to record. He talked about touring, something he had not done since 1966, as though it were not only possible but desirable. He talked about Sean growing up, about what he wanted to teach him, about the kind of father and person he was trying to become. He was not tying up loose ends. He was not speaking in the register of someone making peace with endings. He was speaking in the register of someone who had just found a beginning. One of the most striking passages in the final interview is where John speaks about Yoko Ono, not the Yoko of the mythology, not the woman the press had cast as the villain of the Beatles story, but the Yoko he actually knew, the person he had actually chosen and continued to choose. He said, with a directness that surprised even Sholin, that he would not have survived the 1970s without her. Yeah, the separation of 1973 to 1975, the period John had called his lost weekend, had been one of the lowest periods of his life. He had been in Los Angeles, drinking too much, behaving in ways that filled him with shame when he looked back clearly. And Yoko had taken him back not because she had no other options, but because she had made a choice. And John, on the morning of December 8th, understood the weight of that choice in a way he had not always been capable of. He spoke about their collaboration on Double Fantasy, the album's unusual structure, alternating his songs with hers, a formal equal partnership that was itself a statement with genuine pride, not obligation, but the pride of someone who had watched a person he loved do extraordinary work. He laughed easily when he talked about her. He reached for her hand during certain parts of the conversation with the unthinking naturalness of long habit. The relationship that the world had spent years reading as manipulation was, in that room on that morning, simply love, complicated, tested, durable, real. What John said about Yoko in that interview was something he had been building toward for years. The honesty of it was the honesty of a man who had finally reached a place where he no longer needed to perform his relationships for an audience. He was describing his actual life. And his actual life, it turned out, was something he had found after enormous effort, after genuine loss, to be worth having. There is a passage in the final interview that those who have read the transcript describe as the most quietly devastating. It contains no premonition, no coded farewell. It is simply a father talking about his son. John spoke about Sean with a tenderness that was entirely unguarded. He talked about what it had meant to be present, genuinely, physically, daily present, for the first 5 years of his son's life. The park visits, the baking, the conversations with a small child already showing the sharp curiosity John recognized from his own childhood. He talked about how Sean made him laugh. He talked about the things Sean had said recently that had stopped him in his tracks, the way small children sometimes say true things without knowing they are true. He said something in that interview that would later be repeated in almost every account of his final hours. He said that being Sean's father was the most important thing he had ever done, not writing the Beatles catalog, not Imagine, being present daily and attentively present. For the growth of one small person, that was what he named as the most important thing, coming from a man whose mother had been unable to be present for him, whose father had been absent for most of his childhood. That statement was not casual. It was the conclusion of a very long journey towards something he had been unable to receive as a child and had decided, with the stubbornness that was one of his most consistent qualities, to give anyway. The interview moved on, but that passage, a father describing his son with uncomplicated love and no awareness that by nightfall he would never see him again, is the part that time has not made easier to read. People who conduct many interviews develop a sensitivity to a particular quality in the people they talk with, a quality that has to do with the relationship between what someone says and what they actually mean. Most public conversations involve a gap between those two things. People manage their image, protect their vulnerabilities, present the version of themselves they have decided is acceptable. The gap between the performed self and the actual self is usually audible, even when the performance is skilled. Dave Sholin consistently described John Lennon on that morning as having no gap. What John said was what John meant. The performed self and the actual self had, through whatever process the previous 5 years had involved, collapsed into something unified. He was not presenting a version of himself. He was simply being himself, in the full and undefended sense, in front of people he had no particular reason to trust, but chose to trust anyway. This quality, genuine presence, someone who has stopped performing and started simply existing, is what made the final interview so remarkable to those who participated in it. And it is what makes it, in retrospect, so unbearable. Because what you hear in that interview is not a man wrapping things up. You hear a man beginning. You hear someone who has done the long, unglamorous work of becoming more fully himself, and has arrived at the other side with something to show for it. Someone who is not finished, who has a son to raise and songs already forming in his mind that he will never now record. The interview wrapped up in the early afternoon. Sholin and his team said their goodbyes and left the Dakota. John and Yoko had a recording session that evening at Record Plant Studios, working on a Yoko track called Walking on Thin Ice, with John producing. He was in the middle of something. He was moving forward. The hours between the end of the interview and the evening recording session are documented in fragments, the kind of partial record that ordinary days leave, because ordinary days do not expect to be documented. Photographer Annie Leibovitz came to the Dakota that afternoon for a Rolling Stone shoot. In one photograph, the image that would become one of the most reproduced of the 20th century, John is curled around Yoko's body on a white surface, both of them still, both of them present, the image radiating something that reads unmistakably as peace. Leibovitz later said that when she showed John the photograph, he looked at it and said, "This is it. This is the one." He seemed pleased, settled, like someone exactly where they wanted to be. In the late afternoon, John and Yoko left for the recording session. Fans were gathered outside the Dakota's entrance on West 72nd Street, as they often were. John stopped to sign autographs, as he often did. One of the people he signed for that afternoon was a young man named Mark David Chapman, who had been waiting there earlier and had returned. John signed the copy of Double Fantasy Chapman held out to him. There is a photograph of this moment, too. Chapman returned that evening. At approximately 10:50 in the evening, John and Yoko returned to the Dakota from the recording session. John was shot 4 times in the back at the entrance to the building. He was taken to Roosevelt Hospital by police car. He was pronounced dead on arrival at 11:07 p.m. He was 40 years old. The grief that followed was immediate and global, and for many people of a kind they had not expected. John Lennon had been famous for 20 years, and yet the grief that arrived on December 9th, 1980, was not the grief of losing a celebrity. It was the grief of losing someone specific, someone whose voice and words had accompanied people through their own lives in ways that had made those lives feel less solitary. Someone who had been, in the way that only music can manage, genuinely present in rooms he had never entered, at moments he had never witnessed, for people he had never met. Crowds gathered outside the Dakota. Candles were lit in Central Park. Radio stations played his music for days without interruption. None of it seemed adequate because nothing could be adequate to the specific nature of what had been lost. Not just the catalog of a great artist, but the future. The songs not yet written. The tour he had talked about that morning with genuine excitement. The father Sean would have had for the next 40 years. The man who had spent 5 years becoming more fully himself and had arrived, on the last morning of his life, at something that looked unmistakably like peace. The final interview aired. People heard John talking about the future and understood, listening, that they were hearing a man who did not know he had none. The gap between what he expected and what happened is a kind of wound in the recording, not audible exactly, but present, felt in the ease of a voice that has no reason to be careful. In the years that followed, the final interview became something more than a historical document. It became for many people a kind of gift, not the gift of extraordinary words. John said nothing in that interview designed for posterity. He said ordinary things about his son and his wife and his music and his plans with the honesty of someone who is simply talking rather than performing. And that ordinariness is precisely what makes the document so powerful. What the final interview captures is not John Lennon the icon. It captures John Lennon the person, the actual man who had spent 40 years moving through the world, making extraordinary things and ordinary mistakes, arriving finally at a place where the searching had produced something stable, a man who had learned through the specific and unglamorous curriculum of his own life to be present, to love the people in front of him without reservation. John Lennon did not know on the morning of December 8th, 1980, that he was leaving anything behind. He thought he was simply living his life, a life he had found, after a great deal of difficulty, to be genuinely worth living. He was moving forward. He was making plans. He was, for the first time in a very long time, not afraid of what came next. That is what the final interview gives back. The sound of someone who is not afraid, the voice of a man in the middle of his own life, facing forward, with no idea that the words would outlast him, just a man on an ordinary Tuesday morning in December, being entirely himself, telling the truth, making plans, going home. What John Lennon left behind was not only music, though the music remains extraordinary. He left behind a particular quality of voice, not the singing voice, but the speaking voice, the voice that argued and questioned and refused to be quiet about things that mattered. That voice arrived at its fullest expression in that final interview on the morning of December 8th, because by then the performance was completely gone. What remained was only the person, and the person, it turned out, was someone worth hearing. Sean Lennon grew up, he became a musician. He has spoken about his father carefully and honestly over the years, in the measured way of someone navigating the impossible task of having a private grief that is also a public inheritance. He has said that what he returns to when he thinks about his father is not the music. Though the music is always there, it is something simpler. The memory of a man who was present, who chose, against every incentive that fame provides for doing otherwise, to be a father rather than an icon, for 5 years before the world took him. That choice, ordinary, undramatic, invisible to most people who thought they knew John Lennon, was perhaps the most radical thing he ever did. More radical than the bed-ins, more radical than Imagine. The choice to be present for one small person, daily and without audience, in the full knowledge that the world was watching for something more spectacular, was the choice of someone who had finally understood what mattered. And the final interview is the record of that understanding, expressed simply, honestly, in the voice of a man who had stopped performing and started at last being home. There are mornings that look exactly like every other morning, and then only much later you understand what they actually were. December 8th, 1980 was more than 40 years ago now, and the world has changed in ways that John Lennon could not have imagined. His music plays on platforms that did not exist. His voice reaches ears that were not yet born when he stopped speaking. And the interview, the last one, the ordinary one, the one where a man talked about his son and his wife and his plans with the candor of someone who has stopped being afraid, is still there, still playing, still offering what it offered on the day it was recorded, the sound of someone fully alive on an ordinary morning, not knowing that the morning mattered, and mattering anyway. John Lennon spent 40 years looking for something. In the final interview, you can hear that he had found it. Not fame, which he had had for 20 years and which had not been enough. Not even the music, extraordinary as it was. What he had found was simpler and harder to hold and more valuable than any of those things. He had found a way to be present in his own life, to love the people in front of him, to face forward without fear, to speak honestly without armor. He had found, in other words, exactly what he had been imagining all along. And on the last morning of his life, without knowing it was the last morning, he shared it,